Look at this. Look, I can't believe this. I just can't believe this. This is so unfair. I accidentally leave my car unlocked just one stinking time, and somebody takes it for a joyride, and they steal the stereo, they leave my air freshener, and leave me this wreck. And now I'm the one that has to deal with the police department and the insurance company and the repair people. Look at this thing. Why me? What's this world coming to? I work hard, I pay my taxes, I'm a good person, I don't deserve this. And who steals a 10-year-old economy car? And it's beige! Please! I guess I shouldn't be so surprised. This sort of thing happens all the time, I'm sure. Okay, I'm gonna go home. I'm going to rent a movie where the bad guy gets caught and the good guy gets justice, assuming I still have a big screen TV when I get there. In a skit that you just saw, you were presented with a case of outrage, a person who just wanted justice. I'm sure you've probably felt that way a time or two. That skit worked very well for me because, in point of fact, at one time someone did steal my car. And a number of the emotions that that person went through in the skit were my emotions at the time. So I can relate really well to that whole question. Solomon can relate to that question also, because in the book of Ecclesiastes, he visits the whole question of justice in our world, in our lives, the fairness or lack of fairness that we experience. And it allows us to present an examined approach to the question of pursuing justice. In this lesson, we're going to explore Ecclesiastes chapter 3, starting in verse 16. And Solomon begins to describe what he's seeing in the world in which he lives, which leads him to frustration and leads him to once again conclude that life here on earth with nothing beyond it is frustratingly meaningless. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 16, he says, I saw something else under the sun. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of justice, wickedness was there. I thought in my heart, God will bring to judgment both the righteous and the wicked, for there will be a time for every activity and a time for every deed. And Solomon begins to look at life from the vantage point of pursuing justice. He again concludes that there is frustrating evidence that life under the sun doesn't have justice. He talks about his own personal observations. It's not a matter of philosophical reflection, it's a matter of observation, watching how the world really works. He says, this is what I saw. I saw that there was injustice where I expected justice. And that's a remarkable statement for a king to make, because you would think if anybody was in a position to do something about the injustice of the world, he certainly would be. But in this section, he's not talking about things that are done to make the world more just. He's making the observation that all around him, people get treated unfairly. Injustice exists. It's a plague that seems to cover the entire land and everywhere you look. And he makes a strong contrast by pointing to the fact that it's not just that injustice exists somewhere, it's that injustice exists in the very places that you would expect that it would not. In the court system, for example, the innocent were often found guilty. And there was a guilt to innocence in the sense that justice never seemed to prevail. And even if a person was innocent, it didn't seem to matter. Injustice dominated the world that Solomon lived in, And we can relate to that because it sounds a lot like the world that we live in. Now, Solomon has a theological background. He has a perspective of life from the vantage point of the existence of God. So he adds the hypothetically true reality that our hope is always that there is justice somewhere. If not in our life, if not in our world, then sometime beyond life under the sun. And as he reflects upon that, he makes this grand statement that our hope is always that somehow, somewhere beyond this place in which we live, there will be real justice, where whatever is right will be what prevails. But that's not going to solve the dilemma of living here on earth and the reality that justice is often not available to us. And that leads to an ultimate expression of frustration, which we pick up as we turn to the next few verses. I also thought, as for man, God tests them to see that, so that they may see that they are like the animals. Man's fate is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Man has no advantage over the animal. Everything is meaningless. All go to the same place. All come from dust, and to dust all return. Who knows if the spirit of man rises upward and the spirit of the animal goes down into the earth? He is dealing with the question of the realities of justice and injustice, and as far as anyone can tell, the reality is that people end up with the same miserable condition as animals. And therefore, in that sense, we're basically in the same boat. He presents the reality of injustice and suffering in this life, oppression, as a bit of a test, a means by which man becomes aware of the fact that in this world of suffering and injustice, that they end up virtually being like animals. And from a human perspective, limited to the ideas of what we can see around us, how would you actually know with certainty that the fate of man is ultimately any different than the fate of animals? Now, it's an intriguing idea because what he's saying is there's seemingly no difference between the fate of man and the fate of animals, even though the Old Testament clearly teaches elsewhere that that's not the case. But Solomon is not trying to present the picture of mankind from a biblical perspective in terms of what the Old Testament has taught to this point. He's trying to deal with the question of, if you only have this world, if you only have the limitations of an earthly perspective, if you can't see beyond this moment in time, if you can't see beyond this world, what conclusions can you reasonably draw? He's leading us down another dead end. He's saying, if you're going to put your hope, if you're going to find your significance in pursuing justice, you will ultimately find that your path is meaningless and insignificant. And the basic reason is simply this: because all the stories of life end in death. Whether it's people or it's animals, and it doesn't matter who or where or when or what the circumstances are, everybody dies. And if they're going to die in this world, there is never enough justice. Therefore, if this is the end of the story, so ends the story of justice. And justice can ultimately never be satisfied, at least not for everybody, perhaps not for anybody in an absolute sense. He uses a description that we would probably expected from Old Testament when he talks about man, animals, everybody returns to dust. It all comes down to the same point of contact. If this world is unfair and this world is all there is, then injustice will ultimately prevail. And because anything beyond this moment in time, from the perspective of living under the sun, just in this world, is not quite something that we can fully understand. Eternity is a mystery, and he has to end his question here with, who knows that man's spirit goes up and the spirit of an animal goes down into the ground? But the very fact that he suggests that there are two different categories, two different ways of thinking about it, the very fact that he's aware of an idea of man going to God and animals going into the ground suggests that he's aware that there are assumptions about life after this life. But just looking at this world, just looking at this life, he says injustice is something that we all simply have to endure. And the pursuit of justice as a meaning and a purpose for life will ultimately be a failed pursuit. In chapter 22, he continues this thought. He says, "So I saw that there is nothing better for man than to enjoy his work, because that is his lot. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him?" We might say it another way. We might use the old phrase, carpe diem, seize the day. Solomon is saying, if this life is all there is, then the best we can do is make the most of the day that we have, the day that we've been given. But he might continue that by saying, or not, or whatever. It doesn't really matter, because ultimately the pursuit of right and justice will never be totally satisfied in this life. So the pursuit of using my life and seeing the meaning and purpose of my life as bringing justice to the world, accomplishing what is right, being a good person, and seeing the good prevails will ultimately lead me to yet another dead end. I will find it ultimately meaningless if my only hope for justice is in the goodness of man and what will happen in this place.